Traditionally, motorsports has been seen as a sport for the domain of the rich. How do you make sure that motorsports is open to all people regardless of financial circumstance?
Good question. It was, in the old Brooklands days, big circuit at one point, the Bentley boys. The Bentley boys were all rich. They all did the Le Mans 24-hour race in their Bentley cars, and Rob Walker, Walker's Whiskey, used to change into a dinner jacket for the evening at the Le Mans 24-hour race. So they were all sort of eccentric and very rich. That's certainly not true of today, and it's not true for quite a long time. I personally had no money at all. Neither had Helen. I wish she had. I would love to have married a rich woman, but it didn't happen. So therefore, I made my way. And motor racing allowed me to do all the things that I've ever wished to do. There's nothing missing in my life at all. That's true of Nicky Lauda. That was true of James Hunt, his mum and dad. I mean, he went to a decent school. He went to Wellington, and therefore he was well educated, and he was slightly posh. But he was an exception. Most of the others certainly weren't. Jochen Rindt had no money. Most of the racing drivers, and Graham Hill never had any money. Jim Clark didn't have money as such. They had farms and they had sheep, but they had no cash usually. So that's a generation that suddenly came about. And suddenly, because when you don't have any money, and sometimes you're surrounded by people who do have money, you try like hell to beat that bunch. So when I first went down south to race from Scotland, it was quite primitive in Scotland. When I went down south, everybody seemed richer than the Scottish guys with cars. They were always better dressed. They always had, you know, cars were cleaner and tidier, and it was just a better package. It was, you know, they were more advanced than we were up in Scotland. So I went down with an inferiority complex, like most Scots have an inferiority complex. They've got a chip in their shoulder. They think they're inferior because they're in a wee country up here and they're more sophisticated down south and so forth. And therefore, suddenly you got people coming into the sport that were sometimes mechanics, like I was, and for whatever reason, they tried that wee bit harder. When people have got a lot of money, they sometimes get a little bit laid back. And when mum and daddy give too much money to the younger ones, then they get the same problem. So if you've got to work for it, you usually try harder and you usually finesse it, you usually polish the nails a little bit better. So I think that's probably why that happened. Some of the greatest drivers in the world didn't have any money. Fangio had no money. Perron helped Fangio come to Europe when he was something like 39 years of age. He hadn't been in a Formula One car, and yet he won 5 world championships at that time because he was sent from little Argentina over to the might of Europe with all the fancy folk and Ferraris and Alfa Romeos and Maseratis and so forth. And he beat everybody because he was a hungry man. And Ayrton Senna's daddy was quite well off, but he was sent to Norfolk, to Snetterton, to Jim Russell's driving school. And he was living and sometimes sleeping in the back of a transit van, because that's the way you were. Paul was doing the same with Paul Stewart Racing, and before we created that. So when you're in that condition, you do try harder. So I think that's where the transmission changed and moved up a gear. So the money, from a driver's point of view, there are some drivers come into Formula One with big packages that they've found in Brazil or somewhere else. Very seldom do they make the big time. Very, very seldom. Some people get picked up and come through but just beat everybody like Vettel did. Vettel didn't have any money. So Lewis Hamilton, you know, his parents had no money. He was picked up by Ron Dennis and McLaren. He's a very lucky boy to where he sits today, and he'll probably earn 40 million a year now, and a lot more perhaps in the future. And if he were doing it really well commercially, I made far more money commercially than I ever did as a racing driver. And I'm making considerably more money now than I ever did when I was a racing driver. because I've serviced all these companies particularly well. So, but you've got to work hard to do it. I'm getting criticised by my sons, both of them, and my wife for working too hard. I'm 76 years of age. I love what I do. I don't want to stop it, but I want to deliver. And if I don't deliver, I wouldn't get the relationships that I've got today. I work for UBS today. That's a brand new contract. It's only a 1.5 years old. And I get paid a lot of money by them. So you work harder when you don't have money, basically. So, but even the guys who have had a bit of money, if they're in there getting beaten up by everybody else, you raise your game. And that's a long answer to a short question.